Okay, welcome to part two of major theological themes in Gustavo Gutierrez's Theology of Liberation, brief introductory remarks. There's a intro biography video, and then this is part two of two videos on the major theological themes. All the readings, again, that I'm referencing and all the page numbers I'm referencing, unless otherwise specified, come from this great book. The current edition has a different cover picture on it, but it's the exact same on the inside. It's only the picture that's changed. And again, I would highly recommend this. It's a good addition to your library, a very fine collection of an array of his writings with a very nicely done introduction. Now, a distinguishing characteristic of Gutierrez's writings is the brilliance with which he rereads familiar scriptural passages from the perspective of the impoverished. In 1995, Gutierrez is inducted into the Peruvian Academy of the Spanish Language in Lima. This is a select and prestigious academic society in Peru. Gutierrez was only the third priest to be inducted into this elite society. For his induction address, he performs a fundamental rereading of the familiar Tower of Babel and Pentecost scriptural texts, and simultaneously issues a prophetic challenge to the Peruvian Academy of the Spanish Language. And here, in this relatively late writing, he speaks to the marginalization of indigenous peoples. Now, the predominant reading of the Tower of Babel and Pentecost narratives and the understanding of their interrelationship has been fairly standard in the Christian history of interpretation. The scattering of the people into diverse languages, which prevented them from understanding one another, and so prevented them from completing their tower, has typically been read as a punishment wrought by God against a prideful people who would make a name for themselves by building a tower into the heavens. The story of Pentecost, where people of diverse tongues were, through the power of the Holy Spirit, all able to understand one another, has commonly been set against the Tower of Babel narrative, set as the picture of the reversal of the scattering. So Gutierrez, taking his cue from an unfinished essay by Dante, brings this standard reading into question. First, he notes how often the ancient Jews were defeated and subjugated by surrounding empires. In other words, how often the authors of this narrative, which is probably an exilic narrative, by the way, were defeated and subjected by surrounding empires. Indeed, as Gutierrez would be fully aware, here I shouldn't have gotten ahead of my script, the Tower of Babel narrative may well have reached, most certainly did reach its final form in the exilic period. During the period where the Jews have been completely defeated and taken into Babylon, and they're living in exile. So this is why he argues it is important to read the text as the fruit of the painful historical experience of a subjugated people. Now, this does not, he is quick to stress, eliminate the tower narrative's rejection of the haughtiness of those building the city and tower, but it helps us to realize that this is also the narrative of a political attempt, totalitarian in nature, to dominate people. I mean, that's the purpose of building the city with a tower in its center, is to establish themselves over and against other people. And this, too, he says, is an offense against God. This focuses our attention differently on the contrast between single and diverse languages, in particular drawing our attention to the relation between language and the domination of peoples. That is, Gutierrez says, to the relation between language and empire. To make clear, this is not mere theoretical speculation, and to bring the point home to the Peruvian Academy of the Spanish Language, he cites from the well-known letter Elijo Antonio de Nebrija, sent to Queen Isabella of Spain, who had recently sponsored Christopher Columbus's trip to the Indies. And he sends this letter, Nebrija does, to convince the queen of the importance of adopting and promulgating his newly written Grammatica Castellana is his Spanish grammar. My apologies to any native or just good Spanish speakers for my poor enunciation. Nebrija Gutierrez reminded his audience, who would have been familiar with this material, Nebrija argues to the queen that language has always gone hand in hand with empire, so his book is especially timely because at the moment the queen has under her yoke many barbarian peoples and nations of far-off tongues, peoples that he says must receive the laws that the victor imposes on the vanquished. This same connection between language and empire, Gutierrez continues, was visible vis-a-vis French, the language French, during the time of the French Revolution. Indeed, he continues with an invisible gesture towards globalism, that is, naming the now almost wholly monolingual instrumental discourse of an international economic regime, the sort of regime Pope Francis critiques, Laudato Si. He continues with an invisible gesture towards globalism. The variety of languages must be done away with if progress toward modernity is to be made. Now, against this background, Gutierrez concludes, the diversity of languages for oppressed peoples, whether it's a global language, a singular language of a singular economic system, or a single language imposed as the language of empire, against this background, Gutierrez concludes, the diversity of languages for oppressed peoples, far from being punishment helps to protect their freedom. That is, far from being a punishment, when God defeats the Promethean tower builders by splitting the people up into a diversity of languages, God is portrayed as offering a form of protection against totalitarianism. The scattering is a liberating gift from this perspective. Now, this is me, perhaps to play with the image a bit more along Gutierrez's liberationist lines, one could think specifically first of the sort of workers who typically do the backbreaking labor of building towers or empire, in contrast to the leaders and investors who order their construction. First and second century Christians would also immediately have understood this critique of empire for precisely the for revealing the shadow side of the famed Pax Romana under the famed gift from God, as Caesar Augustus was known. So Caesar Augustus, as the Caesar who brought the Pax Romana and is so celebrated as a gift from God, Caesar is precisely the point of the birth narrative stress upon the suffering of ordinary people such as Joseph and Mary, who are not benefiting but are experiencing terrific hardship in this Pax Romana, and the Gospels contrast in this sense Jesus' vision of peace seen from the underside with history's, which remembers the Pax Romana as simply glorious. So from this beginning, Gutierrez adds nuance to the story of the Pentecost, which he suggests can now be read along a complementary line, in essence as a continuation of the gift of the scattering into diverse tongues. And once one realizes that the scattering is not a curse, but a blessing, which actually protects the diversity of peoples from empire, one realizes the significance of the fact that in the Pentecost narrative, everyone does not understand the gospel in the same language, but all understand the gospel in their own languages. That's the point he's picking out, so that you don't have a reversal from the Tower of Babel to the Pentecost. That standard reversal, it doesn't actually turn out to exist. In both, the scattering, the diversity is affirmed as a gift from God. So the major distinction, he continues, is that the diversity must not only not hinder mutual understanding, but favor it. So Gutierrez works to mitigate the tension between the universal, that is the gospel, which is mutually understood, and the particular, the diverse tongues, the diverse understandings of the gospel in the balance of the essay. He stresses to say again that the diversity of languages must favor not confusion, but mutual understanding. So there's a diversity, but it's not a diversity that fosters alienation and separation, but plurality and mutual understanding. And he specifies that all languages must be capable of narrating the experience of Jesus and of those who have accepted his witness. And at the heart of this narration, he sets the parable of the Good Samaritan, in which the Samaritan is distinguished and celebrated for making those needy into neighbors. And he celebrates Jesus' feeding of the 5,000, which illustrates sensitivity to the hunger and needs of the poor. So on the one hand, the exclusive reference to Jesus, that all language must be capable of narrating, this looks like it might be a little bit in tension with an affirmation of diverse religious traditions. But when he turns to actually making a concrete application, he appeals to parables and acts of ministry in Jesus' ministry, which have analogs in every religious tradition. In other words, love of neighbor, care for the poor and the marginalized. So even there, although he does not develop it in what is an overwhelmingly Roman Catholic Christian context, there is an ability here for one to integrate this with how he might think in terms of an encounter with other religious traditions. Including, by the way, indigenous religious traditions in Peru, which are never developed at length in his work. Now, on the other hand, there's the universality, care for the poor, love of neighbor, making neighbors, making those who are needy one's neighbors in love. On the side of particularity, he emphasizes that insofar as the gospel, as it has moved from what is today Israel-Palestine to North Africa, that is Latin patristic Christendom, that's where the early Latin fathers are, so the heart of part of the heart of early Christianity. As the gospel moves from what is today Israel-Palestine to North Africa and the Middle East, Greek patristic Christendom. So we have in the patristic period, the earliest period of Christianity, the Latin West and the Greek East. This is the birthplace of Christian theology in its developed form, and then it moves, of course, to Western Europe with medieval Catholicism, and then post-Reformation Protestantism and Catholicism, and then into Eastern Europe with medieval and modern Eastern Orthodoxy. In other words, this East-West division continues to this day to some degree with the difference between Protestant and Roman Catholic understanding and Eastern Orthodox understanding. And then, of course, the gospel moves to North America and Latin America, Africa, the Philippines. And by Africa there, of course, I have to mean sub-Saharan Africa, because Northern Africa is part of the birthplace of Christianity. And that's where St. Augustine is born and does his work, among many other patristics. And then we move into the Philippines, Korea, and more. In other words, all in this the modern period, these areas of expansion over the course of history into different regions and are not mere reflections, the way the theology is understood in those regions, of some original teaching, but are also in a significant ways new and independent witnesses to the gospel, each with its own accent in speaking of God. So just so, this is his point of emphasis, the theology emerging in Latin America is not a mere echo, but a theology with a distinctive and indigenous, although this is not the indigenous of the indigenous peoples, but the indigenous of the Spanish-speaking peoples who have been there now for centuries. So as we'll talk about in a bit later, what's indigenous becomes complicated to think about. But his point is, in all these regions, these all become in and of themselves sources, centers of theological understanding, which will add diversity to the understanding of the gospel if they are affirmed in their plurality and discreteness. Now, as Gutierrez is aware, all this raises significant questions, especially insofar as other religions, not Christianity, that's what I was referring to just a second ago, and other languages, not Spanish nor Portuguese, are indigenous to what we now call Central and South America. Remember, we have to remember, it's easy for us to forget this in the Northern American West today. When Martin Luther was born, the reformer who we think of as living not that long ago, when Martin Luther was born, no one in what would be called the Americas spoke any European language. That's pre-contact. English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish are all imports of colonization. And at this point, they've all been spoken here in what is now the Americas, and have been predominant languages in what is now the Americas for centuries. Now, Gutierrez's failure explicitly to name indigenous peoples, languages, and religious traditions here is perhaps disappointing. On the other hand, his audience would have subtly but definitively been awakened to these issues and questions by the overall character of his talk. And in the course of his talk, he's citing people from these various traditions, including some indigenous authors from Peru. Now, we gain some further insight into Gutierrez's view in this regard in the next essay in the Nickoloff anthology, Upstream to the Source. So, leaving a number of these issues open, but also understanding the degree to which he has undone a traditional understanding of the Tower of Babel versus Pentecost account, and found a way to celebrate the plurality of languages without it having, without allowing it to descend into a sectarianism, because his emphasis upon mutual understanding, and then his emphasis upon the parable of the Good Samaritan and Jesus feeding the 5,000. So he has that universal element of the gospel, but nonetheless is leaving space for particular understandings as the gospel is developed in different regions and contexts. Now, Upstream to the Source is a very brief introductory excerpt drawn from a book Gutierrez published 2 years before his acceptance speech to the Peruvian Academy, and it's an extensively researched study of the Dominican bishop Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas, In Search of the Poor of Jesus, this is the title of his book, was written to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Columbus in 1492. Las Casas is famed as the 16th century defender of the Indians. And so Las Casas is here at the very beginning of post-contact America. Now remember, of course, that the indigenous peoples are called Indians because Columbus was sailing in an attempt to establish a sailing route to the Indies. People, contrary to sort of a silly idea that people thought the Earth was flat and he'd fall off the edge of the Earth. Everyone knew the Earth was round in Columbus's day. What they thought was the Earth was too far around, too big, that he could never sail and cover that amount of ocean and get to the Indies from that direction. He'd run out of supplies, which of course he would have. He almost didn't even make it to the Americas. So he didn't realize when that he'd bumped into islands on the edge of a different continent, and so that's why it's the Indies and Indians. So Gutierrez celebrates him, Las Casas that is one who moved above all, and here I think he begins to quote Las Casas, although without a reference, by the charity of Jesus Christ, which knows neither measure nor rest as long as it is a pilgrim on this earth. And he worked, again, I think he here is citing Las Casas' description of his own ministry. I'm missing some possessive punctuation there, sorry. In order the havoc and the massacre committed there, counter to all reason and justice, might cease. So that's Las Casas' estimate of what's actually happening and where the gospel of Jesus Christ places one over and against it. Las Casas, Gutierrez writes, was there at the beginning of a collision or discovery, he puts these, or a collision or discovery in the eyes of Europe, covering in terms of the effective history, long written from the European perspective, invasion, as others call it, from an indigenous perspective today. So I've been calling it contact. Gutierrez says that maybe it's a better collision, or from an indigenous perspective and an invasion. But of course, it's long been called the discovery of the New World from a European perspective. The history kindles mighty passion, Gutierrez says, and he continues, the reason is clear, if in light of just one fact, of course among many, including the persecution of the indigenous population, the decline in population over the 70 or 80 years following the arrival of Columbus can be regarded only as an authentic demographic collapse. Now, there's a lot of different statistics out there. They all seem basically tells basically the same story. The best chart I could find for you here is a graph which just covers Mexico and looks at the population collapse in Mexico that happened immediately following collapse. We're in the midst of a pandemic as I write this, and as serious as it is, it of course pales by comparison to this massive drop in population, if one can imagine what this meant for entire communities just being decimated and devastated. And of course, as we know, this is part of how Europeans were able to colonize so much of the New World with so little resistance. It's because just by contact across this continent, the same thing happened in Africa, Asia, which is all, of course, contiguous. But here, are these devastating population collapse from the introduction of diseases to which the indigenous population had no prior exposure and protection. According to this source, the population levels would not return to 15th century levels in Mexico until the 20th century. It also specifies that smallpox resulted from contact with the Spanish, but the 1545 and 1576 epidemics are now thought to have been indigenous, and the precise identity of this disease actually remains mysterious. Though they say the death rate from these latter epidemics was exacerbated by the harsh conditions imposed on the indigenous peoples by the Spanish encomienda system and a mega drought. So there were other things at play. Now, this is Mexico. You'll find similar statistics about death from epidemics affecting indigenous peoples, and you can find there's a lot of data on this now, though it's been a lot of work to figure out what happened throughout North America and the Southern Americas. But this is a representative picture. What happened is similar in different regions. At some points a little later because of when the contact happened, but highly significant. And just compare the bubonic plague in Europe, which we know of as so awful, which killed 25 million people, which was 50% of the population, but even that pales compared to what happens here in the Americas. And also in this regard, so I'm trying here to just work with us in our context in light of what Gutierrez is saying, but it's so easy for us to have this vision of what is now the United States being essentially settled and complete, and what it is today for centuries, maybe since the time of Washington. This map is indicative because what it's showing is in terms of just having 2 non-Indians per square mile. This is based on the census. The census didn't count Indians, so we don't have those numbers. We just know how many non-Indians there were per square mile. In 1820, as late as 1820, it's only in this area where you have these deep reds, and then it's really maybe a pocket here, here, and here. Although where by 1820 you have more than 2 non-Indians per square mile, and And of course, in this map for this date, there's no way to do it because of the different dates, but they use the contemporary settings. There should be lists of all sorts of Indian nations throughout this entire area. Even by 1850, just before the Civil War, there's only more than 2 non-Indians per square mile only in this region, right? And then even by 1890, as late as 1890, there are only 2 Indians per square mile now in these regions. Of course, that's still very light coverage. So it's just, this is in the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of the American Indian, just trying to get us to realize how recent the demographic transitions have been. Now, you can also think of the population of bison in North America in the 19th century, the same period. In 1800, there were 30 million bison that were roaming the plains and much of Middle America. By 1860, there were 10 million, a massive reduction. And then by 1886, just in that 26-year period, we get down to less than 1,000 bison. So from 30 million to less than 1,000 over the course of the 19th century. Peter Hill, illustrating the sort of instrumental thinking Gutierrez refers to Allah Habimas, right? Instrumental thinking, which is only calculated in terms of numbers, quantity, figures, usually indexed to economic gains or losses. Peter Hill, thinking in this way, can see this decline in the bison population as a positive development because it is directly related to a dramatic increase in the number of cattle, and he argues cattle signify a more efficient conversion of grass into dollars. So that's the sort of instrumental logic which Gutierrez is critiquing. It's not to be set aside, right? It's just, it can't be the only logic in play. We're going to see him developing this more later, but by which one can see this devastation of bison as actually a gain. Now, insofar as several nations, in fact, many nations of indigenous peoples, not to mention numerous flora and fauna, were also dependent upon the bison herds, the extermination of the bison was directly related to the decline of indigenous peoples' flora and fauna. And again, to work with this thing, I talked about this before when we talked about Wesley, and this is a period from Wesley's time here, how color can be deceptive, right? And then what is and is not on a map. So Georgia, this red here is what was ceded to as Georgia, the settlement of Georgia. But as we know, at this time, the dot where you have Savannah and then Fort George, I mean, these are essentially the only English settlements in Georgia, and they're tiny. This whole area is completely controlled by other Indian nations at this point. So the color is very deceptive here in the use of color. So we want to kind of keep track of these things, and this again would be a liberationist perspective that Gutierrez wants us to keep track of, the ways in which language and mapping and the drawing of borders and use of colors promotes empire. It erases diversity. Let's consider, this again is from 1735, you can see color being used here. This is again in the same time period, 1700 to 1760. Note again the absence of any names of the Indian peoples Indian nations that have this land, and then the use of color in terms of the various European colonial claims to the land. So it's, I grew up thinking this way. I saw these maps, and these were just, this was France, this was Spanish, this was English. Up here's some Russian. When I was educated in middle school and high school, there just was not mention ever really that this land had been long settled with indigenous peoples. Now we're finding cities in what's now Mexico that were the size of Manhattan today. Really quite fully developed and full cultures and a land full of people that was kind of erased. You can contrast this, for instance, and here I'm going to look to where I'm from, here in Austin and speaking from, which is right in here, in this area. This is from the exact same period, in fact, a little bit later, the 1770s, 1780s. But here, instead of the colors of the European peoples and the European claimed borders and even areas of some control, this is focused on Comancheria, which at this point is greatly reduced in size, but still by 1770s, early 1780s, this period is Comanche, solidly controlled Comanche territory, and this is areas where the Comanche are raiding. And in here you have the names of the French and English and Spanish and other settlements, but instead of the colors giving you a sense of its huge control of land, you realize that it's just these points where there's effective control, and the rest is in play between different forces. So, though he wants to celebrate the protests, reflections, and engagements of so many missionaries of the 16th century, Gutierrez accepts the complicity of the church in the invasion and forced labor imposed upon indigenous peoples. So again, I was trying to use those maps, and maybe you all, I mean, today I think our education has changed in good ways, but it's still so easy not to keep track of what the recent history, right? I mean, this is all, everything I showed you is from Wesley's day, right? So not that long ago, when different peoples controlled these lands. So, and the church, he says, is complicit in this. Gutierrez, however, says he does not want to be trapped in a fog of emotions or hound down judgments that would be anachronistic in the face of history's advance, in the presence of irreversible situations. A consideration of what happened from the 16th century onward must not be transformed into an invitation to turn back the clock of history. History cannot be remade. This is simple realism. Now, I think Gutierrez's moves here might be very controversial, and it would be easy at this point to start arguing and get caught in precisely the fog, the protective fog, Gutierrez wants to keep us out of, for he is trying in this essay to hold up a mirror and reflect upon a very particular reality. Now, I return to the question of irreversible and simple realism below, but here Gutierrez wants, I'll say once again, to direct our attention to a very particular reality. Now, so as we look back at the 16th century and the next 4 centuries in Latin America, and of course there's a parallel sort of history, as I was trying to refer a second ago, going on in North America, we easily condemn the conquistadors and missionaries who were part of the empire's advance, and it's in the brutal subjugation of indigenous peoples for God, gold, and glory, as the expression goes. And we easily see why we would celebrate Las Casas and condemn the many missionaries who were complicit with the conquerors. But, Gutierrez asks quietly, how should our judgment of people then serve us as guidelines for our own day? And this is where he really wants to home in. Because he continues, with regard to the exploitation and oppression of the American Indians of those days, unfortunately, he says, something of the same must be said of the poor today in Latin America, who continue to suffer a premature, unjust death. This is where he's really going to make his turn and get to the point. So Gutierrez is, of course, speaking here to Peruvian elites and to international regimes with influence in Peru. But I think he also is speaking to us in the United States, asking us if we are imitating Las Casas, who was imitating Jesus Christ, asking us if we are noticing and naming and speaking out about the neocolonial dynamics of economic globalism and the plight of the poor here at home and abroad. So to be a bit more precise, in a sense that would be consistent with Gutierrez's challenge, but to use a contemporary example, many of us are concerned about people trying to cross our borders, are concerned that they receive shelter, food, security, and if necessary, asylum. But are we working to determine what dynamics are leading so many people to flee? Some with their families, some having to leave their family. Are we working to determine what dynamics are leading so many people to flee their homes? Are we considering the ways in which the consequences of colonialism, international policies, and the forces of globalization may be contributing to or even causing the conditions which are leading so many to take such desperate measures? Are we informed about the role of the United States in forming and defending transnational legal and economic regimes which perpetuate injustice? So like Las Casas, we still are facing a similar situation, Gutierrez is saying. Are we being like Las Casas, who we celebrate when we look into the past? It seems so clear. But are we today imitating Las Casas, who's imitating Jesus Christ? Are we naming, publicizing, protesting? That's the point he wants to drive towards. In other words, and obviously this is controversial, but I think we need to at least to hear the challenge. Gutierrez is saying, 500 years on, it looks like we clearly identify and condemn colonial actions which exploited and oppressed in the past. Actions that a precious few like Las Casas had the love and courage to name and condemn. Gutierrez is seeing the same sort of exploitation and oppression to the benefit of local and international elites in the present, and asks, are we with and like Las Casas now? Does Las Casas, who lived out the charity of Jesus Christ, which knows neither measure nor rest as long as it is a pilgrim on this earth, give us our guidelines for now? That is Gutierrez's question and challenge. Now, all this is extremely controversial, and trying to argue for the accuracy of Gutierrez's question in detail is beyond our brief in this class, and in my brief in this lecture. I will say that my personal experiences in the Philippines and in Africa, and also my reading, has made me very sympathetic to Gutierrez's contention, and I will again gesture here towards Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si for excellent and practical, really doable suggestions for transforming our world, mainly by ensuring that a diversity of voices are included and the diverse interests fairly represented in rooms where the specific forms of international economic and legal regimes are being hammered out. There is a stunning and very harmful lack of diversity in those rooms. I think one reason Pope Francis's recommendation is so solid is that it speaks to ways to shape inclusive and expert decision-making bodies for the, instead of giving the solutions, because the issues are so incredibly complex and require such sophisticated strategic, economic, and legal expertise. They're just too complex for us to just give a solution. What we need is people with expertise in all these areas to be in rooms where they're also informed by and in direct dialogue with peoples representing diverse interests, in particular interests of those who are marginalized. So theologians and others may be able to articulate ethical and spiritual ideals, and the connections between faith in Jesus and salvation, and salvation from, the connections between faith in Jesus Christ and salvation from economic, political, cultural poverty, and spiritual alienization, that is, salvation from impoverishment in all the diverse forms Gutierrez identifies. That's obvious. Those connections are obvious. But we need people of faith, or at least people willing to listen to people of faith, with expertise in economics, politics, law, medicine, and other areas, not just theology and spirituality and ethics, in order to understand how we might formulate viable solutions, or at least viable, and this I think is consistent with Gutierrez, as we'll talk about later, viable changes or ordering of the regimes which will move us forward in towards a more just world. So Gutierrez's role in this regard is pastoral with regard to his own congregation. And from that context, out of that context, it's prophetic with regard to the whole, a naming of injustice and a call to repentance, individual, collective, and consequential turning. But you'll note he does not begin to traffic in the areas of law and economics and development of policy that he realizes requires expertise he does not have. But that expertise is also in need of the sort of prophetic call that Gutierrez issues, and awareness of the challenges facing marginalized peoples, which he gains from his pastoral work. Yeah. Now, this next is an excerpt from A Theology of Liberation, his kind of seminal book. Note again here Gutierrez's focus upon Scripture as he unfolds the political, cultural, social, economic, and spiritual dimensions of the biblical call to love. You obviously note some repetition in all of this, but I think by the end you're going to have a good sense of, at least a good introductory sense of how he's kind of framing these relationships. Now, Gutierrez's key texts here are Matthew 25, 31 to 46, the parable of the sheep and the goats, and then Luke 10, 29 to 37, the parable of the Good Samaritan, two, obviously famous parables from the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, and also select texts from the prophets, from Jeremiah, Isaiah, Hosea, and from 1 John. For instance, 1 John 4, 7 to 8, everyone who loves is a child of God and knows God, but the unloving know nothing of God. And also of James, faith without works faith without works is dead. His interpretation of these texts, in line with his expansive understanding of the scope of liberation, is so obvious that often commentary upon their meanings simply sounds redundant. And I think I note in a moment if I don't, but of course his appeal to these texts is very similar to John Wesley's. And he even meets some of the same challenges, accused of having substituted works for faith. He defends himself against that, very much like Wesley, where in his defense he resorts, just like Wesley, to James. And the demons believe and shudder. All right, so in his first section, to know God is to do justice, Gutierrez cites numerous texts from the Hebrew Scriptures which identify love of God directly with doing justice. And he is making clear that the obvious teaching of the parable of the sheep and the goats, namely that when we have loved, that is, when we have fed, clothed, comforted, visited the most impoverished among us, we have fed, clothed, and comforted and visited God. All this names the equivalence of concrete love of neighbor with love of God. In a word, he is making clear that, as I started saying a second ago, Jesus' parable of the sheep and the goats is continuous with the repeated witness of the Hebrew Scriptures, which he is citing. I'll cite but one of his many examples in this essay. We love God by loving neighbor, Gutierrez says. Is not this what I require of you as a fast? He's now quoting Isaiah, to loose the fetters of injustice, to untie the knots of the yoke, to snap every yoke and set free those who have been crushed. Is not sharing your food with the hungry, taking the homeless poor into your house, clothing the naked when you meet them, and never evading a duty to your kinfolks? Is it not that? Is not this what I require of you, says the Lord? Now, Gutierrez is aware that there has been an attempt to tame these passages by interpreting neighbor or brethren, especially vis-a-vis the parable of sheep and goats, in religious or national ethnic terms. In other words, only fellow Jews or fellow Christians are neighbors, which is why he stresses that the references to aliens in these texts and in the prophetic texts, who together with widows and orphans form a classic trilogy, indicate an effort to transcend these limitations. An inference supported by the reference in Matthew 25:37 to all nations. So with specific regard to the parable of the Good Samaritan, Gutierrez stresses that the neighbor was a Samaritan who approached the wounded man and made him his neighbor. In other words, this also displaces an argument that the neighbors are only fellow Jews or fellow Christians or something like that. The neighbor is the one in need who we make neighbor because, as it says in the parable, our hearts are melting. That's why the Samaritan approaches the man on the side of the road. It's not out of a religious obligation, but because its heart is melting. So along these lines, it's key to note the obvious, namely that the Samaritan did not act out of religious obligation, nor out of focused and conscious love for God, for it is the love directly for the neighbor, the melting of heart for that other person, which is love for God. That is, love for God, I'm quoting now, is unavoidably expressed through love of one's neighbor. This means, Gutierrez stresses, the neighbor is not an occasion, an instrument for becoming closer to God. It's the neighbor you're concerned about, not the way in which the neighbor allows you to change your relationship to God. This means, Gutierrez stresses, the neighbor is not an occasion, an instrument for becoming closer to God. No one should love their neighbor in order to love God, let alone in order to be obedient to God. For the love of God is expressed in true love for the persons themselves. Now, in addition, Gutierrez adds, we must avoid the pitfalls of individualistic charity. That is, he is aware that the parable of the Good Samaritan could facilitate inattention to systemic distortions, to the need to love neighbor also, in part, by working to resist and dismantle sources of systemic oppression. To repeat, this is not an either-or, but a both-and, focused both upon individuals and struggles. Now, in the 1980s, there was, and today there still is in some precincts, a famous debate over a small but key difference in the phrasing of Jesus' Beatitudes in Luke and Matthew. Luke, for instance, says, blessed are the poor, while Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit. And there has been significant support for an interpretation which takes Matthew to be clarifying the meaning of Luke, or as Gutierrez specifies with a nod to biblical studies, which takes Matthew to be clarifying the meaning of their common source. So Matthew is not clarifying Luke. He doesn't have access to Luke, but they have a common source. And Matthew helps us understanding the meaning of that source that even Luke is using by adding the poor in spirit. So, and this means that in both Luke and Matthew, it's not that the poor are blessed, but those who are poor in spirit are blessed. And so it should be read in a wholly spiritual sense, both of the Beatitudes. Gutierrez even notes how some interpreters, hoping to forestall a wholly spiritual interpretation, have translated the Matthew passage, blessed are they who choose to be poor. And this might sound like it'd be, in some ways, it's very friendly to Gutierrez, but Gutierrez appreciates the intention behind this translation, but he says we cannot accept it because it's, one, inaccurate to the Greek, and it also remains ambiguous. Why are the poor blessed? He clarifies that it is important not to think that it is good to be poor. The choose to be poor, then, must be understood, even if we were to accept it, in a context of injustice, where the choice to be poor represents an action that is designed to redress injustice. This would be the sense in which the minimalists give us our daily bread should be understood to presume a context of injustice. In a context of injustice, you're not looking for more than you need, but because of the needs of others. It is this potential confusion and need for significant explanation which makes the interpretation ambiguous. If we just say, blessed are those who choose to be poor. It's inaccurate because the choose to be is simply not present in the Greek. Now, Gutierrez interprets Luke's blessed are the poor, right, where it's not in spirit at all. He interprets that in line with his own emphasis upon God's gratuitousness. God loves even those who are marginalized and impoverished in society. As I said above, I think it's important to interpret God's gratuitous love for the poor in lines with preferential, in the preferential option for the poor triage sense. Now, it's not obvious to me, frankly, that this is Luke's meaning, but in any case, Luke forecloses on the idea, popular in many guises throughout history and across religious traditions, that somehow the rich are more blessed, and the poor, as evidenced simply by their poverty, are somehow guilty or less beloved. I mean, at least that is undone there. And in that sense, the gratuitous love, gratuitousness of God's love is preserved in the emphasis. But Gutierrez's focuses upon Matthew, not Luke, which is seen to be the more useful phrasing for those interested in social justice, but upon Matthew, That's where his focus is, as the one that's actually the beatitude more promising for those interested in liberation in its expansive senses. So for in whatever way the Luke passage is interpreted, he says, apart from an interpretation revised in accordance with Matthew's in spirit, on any reading, Luke is somehow saying that the poor are blessed, and in Matthew, Jesus is understood to be referring only to one's spirituality. I think somehow I lost the thought there. Maybe it's because I was integrating some of my ideas. But just to put this in other words, again, typically the social justice folks focus on Luke because it says, "Blessed are the poor." People who want a wholly spiritual interpretation want to focus on Matthew and even have Matthew refine what Luke is actually meaning by "Blessed are the poor in spirit." It's not the poor and the poor in spirit. That's the interpretation that most people think facilitates a spiritualized understanding of salvation, which is not helpful to the poor. What Gutierrez is about to do is to show that it's actually Matthew who has the more rigorous demand in terms of our concrete help for the poor. In sum, maybe this will help, in the debate of the day in the mid-1980s, Luke was typically taken to be referring to material poverty and Matthew to spiritual poverty. So Luke was applauded by those interested in social justice, while Matthew was applauded by those who think the scriptures are about spiritual matters, not material. Since Jesus, the thinking went, must have meant one thing or another when he taught the Beatitudes, Luke should be interpreted in accord with Matthew's more specific and clearly spiritual meaning. That clarifies the ambiguity in Luke. It's not the poor, it's the poor in spirit. Others argued that we should affirm the Beatitude in both the sense of Luke, material, and the sense of Matthew, spiritual. As we will see, Gutierrez makes an unanticipated move that reframes the entire debate by interpreting Matthew in the spiritual sense, but making clear how that is actually consistent with a stress upon the connection between the gospel and social justice. So first, Gutierrez makes the obvious but neglected point that interpreting Matthew's poor in spirit in an exclusively spiritual sense is inconsistent with the balance of Jesus' teachings in Matthew. Consider, Gutierrez says, that the Beatitudes passage initiates Jesus' preaching ministry in the Gospel of Matthew, while Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats, closes the preaching of Jesus in the ministry. And the parable of the sheep and the goats, as we've discussed, famously identifies love of neighbor with love of God, and love of neighbor in the parable is identified as wholly concrete, which is to say, there is no discrete belief or spiritual confession that separates the sheep from the goats. The only issues are wholly concrete. Did you feed, visit, comfort, clothe those in need? So interpreting the Beatitudes of Matthew in a wholly spiritual sense creates an odd asymmetry between the beginning and end of Jesus' teaching and preaching in Matthew. This leads Gutierrez to ask, is there another way to interpret Matthew which will result in a greater consistency in Matthew's presentation of the public teachings of Jesus? What he asks, does it mean to be poor in spirit? And he notes that in Proverbs, lofty in spirit means haughty, and in Isaiah, erring in spirit means one who has gone astray. Poor in spirit, along these lines, is not a reference then to a lack of material goods, but to spiritual humility before God, such that in the Gospels, poor in spirit, argues Gutierrez, is a synonym for disciple of Christ. Disciples of Christ, moreover, are called throughout the Beatitudes and Matthew to be those who hunger and thirst after the kingdom of God, and who are blessed as well if they are persecuted because of it. There is, Gutierrez argues, a tight connection between the kingdom of God and the justice of God. And all this is from Matthew, especially when one considers that in the verses immediately after the Beatitudes, disciples are persons called to bear witness by concrete actions through good works, which are works of mercy, like those then listed at the end of Jesus' preaching ministry in Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and goats: feed, clothe, visit, comfort. So on Gutierrez's reading, which entirely displaces the standard debate, it is Matthew's "Blessed are the poor in spirit," not Luke's "Blessed are the poor," which gives us the more demanding version of the Beatitudes vis-a-vis concrete action and social justice. The Matthean approach, concludes Gutierrez, is especially demanding. The followers of Jesus are those who translate the grace they have received into works for the neighbor and especially the poor. And so Gutierrez's interpretation, which allows for a more consistent reading of the emphases in Matthew, reading of the emphasis in Matthew. For Jesus' preaching in Matthew begins with the Beatitudes and ends with the parable of the sheep and the goats. And now we realize that both equate the character of the blessed who are poor in spirit to be identical to the character of the sheep who feed, clothe, comfort, and visit. Once Gutierrez points them out, these connections appear rather obvious, but they did not occur to exegetes from more elite social locations. This illustrates the power of systemic distortions and, since there is no possibility of attaining a wholly objective point of view, the value of including voices from discrete perspectives into biblical and theological conversations. So Gutierrez makes a move here which is not conceptually difficult, but it was one which entirely escaped experts in exegesis from elite locations, but which was very quickly obvious to Gutierrez working from a context of a ministry embedded within communities of the poor. So that's what he does with the Beatitudes, which is an extraordinarily creative and productive interpretation. So now, the Christ the Liberator in Eschatology and Politics. Closing with this, I'm going to treat both these brief readings that Nickoloff excerpts from a Theology of Liberation, again from a Theology of Liberation, together, since they're both focused upon broadening our notion of salvation. And again, we're going to see a radiation and developing of the themes that we've already encountered. So Gutierrez has no problem, this is important, it's not an either or, no problem affirming the work accomplished in Jesus Christ in traditional terms. Quoting, by his death and resurrection, Christ redeems us from sin and all its consequences. We have also seen him, like Wesley, affirm belief in a life after death. And again, like Wesley, he is interested still in the character of salvation in and for the present. But Gutierrez's decisive contribution, where he steps beyond Wesley as a result of the insights gained through the developments of the social sciences, in particular as a result of what are known as the critical social sciences, his decisive contribution lies in the way he is attuned to structural, systemic dynamics of oppression. See Wright-Mills' Issues, where Wesley was more focused upon acting to meet present needs on a case-by-case basis. See Wright-Mills' Troubles. It is this awareness that lends a broader, more historical character to Gutierrez's thought, for he is aware of how the sweep of history has resulted in current oppressions, and he has a vision for our call as Christians to look towards an ideal future and to strive to shape the flow of history so that increasingly, as much as is possible, God's will be done on earth as in heaven. So Gutierrez's expansive notion of salvation is evident in a passage from Medellin's statement, which he helped to write. It is the same God who, in the fullness of time, sends his Son so that in the flesh he might come to liberate all from all forms of slavery to which sin has subjected them. And now this is Gutierrez commenting on Medellin. This is why Christian life is a Passover. A passage from sin to grace, from death to life, from injustice to justice, from the subhuman to the human. Christ conquers sin, which is the negation of love and all its consequences. So in accord with his expansive understanding of salvation and liberation, Gutierrez expands his notion of eschatology. For many Christians, eschatology has to do wholly with heaven and perhaps God's final reign at the end of time. Gutierrez does not reject this dimension of eschatology, but he also wants Christians to envision and to be guided by, in a sense familiar from the prophets, a Christian vision of what a faithful world, a wholly just and loving world, would look like. And in order to speak of eschatology in this more prophetic sense, he invokes the category of utopia, which is a this worldly dimension of eschatology that can serve as a driving force of a future-oriented history as we actively struggle to shape the future of human society. Now, Gutierrez reminds us of the specifics of Thomas More's classic Utopia, written in 1516, right alongside the Reformer, at the same time as the Reformer, Martin Luther, almost exactly. Noting that More's Utopia was significant because of its relationship to More's contemporary context, namely the dismal, oppressive realities of 16th century England, which were the opposite of More's imagined country of utopia in every way. He reminds us of this and says this is why it's significant. It's the opposite of this. The fiction of the country of utopia, says Gutierrez, in which it's the opposite of this, in which the common good is paramount, where there is no private property, no money or privilege, was the opposite of his own country, England, in whose politics he was involved. More's utopia, Gutierrez continues, is a city of the future, something to be achieved, not a return to a lost paradise. This is a sense in which a Christian imagining of utopia, which may not be that different in essentials from More's vision, can set a trajectory for our concrete engagement in shaping historical realities. Now note the patience and long-term but definitive and guiding vision implied by this way of construing a future-oriented history. Note what this would mean for concrete negotiations and formulations of trade agreements and of legal and economic regimes and of national and international treaties. Imagine the question, given the necessities, imperfections, and limitations imposed upon us in the present, does this move this way of formulating these new rules we're working on here, do they move us closer to utopia? What if this was always on the table and in play? Then policies would be in accord not only with development, typically read as economic development, but with liberation in all its different meanings. Given the way in which self-interest and economic gain appear to dictate the global realpolitik of our day, Gutierrez's hopes here can seem impossibly unrealistic. To some degree, dystopia and fatalism in the guise of realism are the coin of public imagination. You can think of any number of recent movies, 2012, The Day After Tomorrow, Snowpiercer. I think it's The Day After Tomorrow. I'm wondering if that's the wrong title. But anyway, the one about the sudden catastrophic climate change where things freezes very quickly. These and other movies and books you're familiar with, they pictured these dystopian futures. So consider how dystopias can foster a sense of fatalism and so kind of rob us of energy to try and act and transform the world, in contrast to hopes for utopia, even if it is a hopefulness tempered by realism. To say again, Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical Laudato Si provides pragmatic suggestions for putting something like this on the table, getting it into play by transforming current practice through deliberate inclusion of diverse voices at key negotiating tables. This simple step would be a major departure from current practice, where only political and economic elites are at vital negotiating tables. Even if they're high-minded elites, they will not see the issues as clearly, and they will not value them as thoroughly as those who are from these diverse communities. So current practice is most likely to ensure continuation of an increasingly inequitable status quo, for the major players are all invested in the status quo. Note, like Gutierrez, the Pope's proposal is pragmatic and reformist, not idealistic and revolutionary. Still, despite an initial flurry of interest because of his mention of climate change, and despite the fact that his proposal is modest and in accord not only with Christian ideals, but with basic ideals and notions of justice common to virtually every religious and secular ethical understanding on earth. I mean, despite all of this, Laudato Si is globally moribund. How do you say that? Now let me return to our reading of Gutierrez and note how he unfolds liberation in three distinct senses, the third of which correlates to salvation in the common sense. He says, in trying to understand the notion of liberation, I said that we were dealing with a single process, yet it is a complex, differentiated unity. Note here, there's not a sectarianism and there's not a uniformism. It's a differentiated unity which encompasses, without confusing, distinct levels of meaning. That one's in the wrong place. One, economic, social, and political liberation, where what we should be using is scientific rationality in hopes of transforming political action. Two, liberation which leads to the creation of new men and women in a society of solidarity. And here's where he talks about utopia and the historical project. Note again this long view of history that's presumed here. So again, reformist, not revolutionary. Realist, not simply idealistic. Idealistic with realism, a utopia with a long flow of history. And three, liberation from sin and entrance into communion with God and with all others, faith. And this is what's the more common understanding of the notions of faith and salvation. With regard to liberation in the first sense, liberation from oppressive economic, social, and political structures, Gutierrez stresses the need to utilize scientific rationality as one sets about transforming political action. Now here I think Gutierrez is stressing the importance of acting in accord with political realism, not misplaced religious idealism or ideological purity, which will brook no compromise, and which refuses to acknowledge the limits inherent to economic, social, and political transformation. The difference lies between those who use scientific rationality and shape economic and political regimes in order to shore up an affluence which depends upon the oppression of other people. In other words, those whose affluence depends upon sweatshop labor. As for all of us in the United States, our affluence in part does depend on sweatshop labor. If you own pretty much any iPhone or electric phone, then you are depending on what's essentially sweatshop labor, both in the assemblies of the products and in the mining of critical resources. The difference is between those who use scientific rationality, who in order to secure their affluence, and those who, informed by utopian vision and faith, use scientific rationality and economic and political regimes toward the end of freeing all from powers which enslave individuals and exploit social classes. It is with regard to the second dimension of liberation which leads to the creation of new men and women in a society of solidarity, where he invokes visions of utopia and thinking in terms of a long-range historical project. That, of course, is what needs to influence people in the first range. That's where these are not unconnected areas. So you need that utopian vision to then inform your economic rationality. Now, at this point, his talk of creation of new men and women, in combination with his prior unqualified invocation of Marx, may rightly raise some red flags. So I couldn't resist. For a prominent and devastatingly confused variation of Marxism, combined Marxist ideals, which are pretty much equivalent to utopian ideals, with a confidence in the potential of social engineering to create genuinely new men and women who are all raised to care for all, all raised in kind of new societies to care for all and equally work for the common good. Suddenly we're going to have societies that created good people, just completely good people. Now, this sort of naive and arrogant, frankly, thinking was part of what facilitated the revolutionary, disastrous, and brutal Marxist regimes of the 20th century. Is Gutierrez still caught up in this confusion when developing his theology of liberation in the early 70s? Does he not realize the terrible dangers that result, in theological terms, from Marx's lack of doctrines of sin? In other words, the power of individual selfishness, which you're not simply going to eliminate in some new iteration of the society, and the doctrine of original sin, which is not to something someone did in the past. Original sin is a reference to structural evil that we all find ourselves born into. It's a reference to intergenerational structural evil, a reference made to indicate this, which you also find reflected in the Hebrew Scriptures, before you have the benefits of the social sciences to give it kind of a logic and to unpack it with some precision. I can see why some of his comments could raise this concern. But I think there are reasons to suspect to the contrary, that even if Gutierrez was insufficiently critical of Marx in this early period, we can easily criticize that element of Gutierrez's thought while still appreciating and affirming his enhancement of the real-world implications of what it means for us to turn and be saved. But still, I don't actually think he was much caught up in this for the reasons I'm about to give you. He wasn't naively affirming of Marx. Now, one reason I think Gutierrez is not taken in by Marx's naivete is that he takes care to say explicitly that we should not confuse realization of the kingdom of God on earth with any historical stage. Now, I think this should be seen as a pretty explicit caution against the way many 20th century Marxists, confident that they knew how society should ideally be shaped, used conviction about their knowledge of the final stage of ideal development in order to justify brutal short-term means to attain their ideal. A move which actually produced brutal revolutions and dictatorial oppressive regimes, which ended up creating not new men and women, but new groups of elites who immediately busied themselves securing their own affluence within their new society. So again, Gutierrez's caution not to equate the ideal political form with any historical stage is a fairly direct rebuke of any group's pretension to know so much about how to create an ideal society that they justified violent and revolutionary transitions to what proved to be repressive regimes. And this is a pretty direct criticism. It's a very direct criticism of Marxist regimes in the 20th century. Now, not only is this warning against idealizing any historical stage, but remember how Gutierrez links his second form of liberation, the broad historical vision, which allows us to understand how people in the present are caught in systemically distorted political, legal, and economic forms, even as we contrast this reality, the reality of our present, where we are, with our vision of what should be, or would be in the long run, our provisional vision of what should be, the utopia we might strive ever towards, right? So in other words, where the Marxists presumed to have their vision of utopia and used that to justify this rapid revolutionary transition to what they knew was the final stage, Gutierrez is urging us to retain a vision of utopia, a provisional vision. It may, we may learn and grow what that's going to look like in the future, but it's a distant future, but it keeps us focused on something ideal. So even as we work in the present, working with systems of oppression that have their roots in deep histories of social, political, and economic dynamics, right? We're not going to make, there's this long view here. It's a reformist view, not something which is going to some immediate change. So Gutierrez's tone and vision here is realist and reformist, not idealistic and revolutionary. It is realist and reformist even as it is energized by explicit understandings of oppressive systemic distortions, issues in society, and ever driven towards realization of a utopian ideal which may ever be beyond the reach of history. We may not ever attain it, but even if we don't, we always want to be trying and struggling to move towards it. His vision here is similar to Martin Luther King's image of the universe slowly but surely arcing towards justice. But what he wants is for us to be sure that we understand ourselves as Christians, and I'm sure this is what Luther King thought too, to be participating in trying to arc the universe towards justice. It's not just a passive waiting because that's inevitably going to happen. It's something that we are called to struggle to as Christians, as people of faith. So in addition to his clearly reformist, not revolutionary leanings, his emphasis upon using utopian thinking to orient oneself in the broad sweep of history, those are two reasons I don't think he should be seen as being Marxist. There is also the fact that his threefold emphasis appears to be continuous, the three forms of liberation, with the traditional emphasis upon the threefold roles of priest, prophet, and king, or we might say priest, prophet, and sovereign, whatever form of sovereignty, whatever politic we're talking about. The standard priest, prophet, sovereign schema should be read as the recommendation for continual preservation in society of a plurality of roles. The priestly, which has to do with the regular provision for the cares of the people and maintaining awareness of and fidelity to God. This is Gutierrez's third form of liberation, salvation from sin, which is the most common way that Christians often understand in a limited sense what it is that the church and salvation about. But there's also the prophetic, which has to do with identifying and speaking out against injustices. This is Gutierrez's second historical utopian sort of liberation. And then there's the political, the sovereign, which informed by utopian vision, right? So this is the first form of liberation, the economic rationality, informed by utopian vision, deals with the immediate legal, economic, and security needs of the state. And this, again, correlates to Gutierrez's first form of liberation. The idea is that a healthy society will retain space for all three distinct types of roles and will not confuse them, though various persons may at one time or another find themselves cast in diverse roles. And it's important not to confuse them because priests and prophets don't make good rulers. And rulers become tyrants when they are not moderated by the power of priests and prophets. And neither rulers nor prophets are well suited to sustaining and ministering to the ordinary personal and spiritual needs of the community. And neither priests nor rulers are well positioned to give prophetic voice to the present in relation to their vision of a utopian ideal. Right? So they all have their discrete strengths, which the other two shouldn't interfere with, or else you get yourself into trouble. All three discrete roles, prophet, priest, and sovereign, will be part of a healthy society. And again, in individual lives, the lines between these three may not be discrete. But it's important to keep track of when you're in one place or another. Okay. Attention to liberation in the first two senses provides, Gutierrez believes, and the first two sentences are the political transformation and the sweep of history and the economic rationality, an essential corrective to the wholly spiritualized understanding of liberation that afflicts much modern Christian confession. These first two dimensions of liberation are in line, to say again, with the call of the prophets and to performative utterance of thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. These are two emphases that Gutierrez believes are too easily lost by Christians who are affluent and who, as a result, tend not to think of liberation in these first two senses, but only in terms of private salvation from sin and its consequences. And again, Gutierrez does not disregard personal salvation from sin and communion with God, but he includes it as his third form of liberation, speaking of it in terms of the salvation which comes through faith. Now, let me conclude by making some general remarks relating liberation theology to the so-called politics of recognition, post-colonial theory, and decolonial theory. All of these name complex and diverse phenomena, so please regard my remarks as merely thought-provoking and partial. These are hugely complex areas. But I'm gonna go ahead and sin boldly in the hope that somehow it's productive. So first, liberation theology and the politics of recognition, which is a focus on identity. It's also called identity politics. And these are related to the shift from modern to postmodern rationality that I've discussed previously. In a word, for modern rationality, reason is universal and objective. For postmodern rationality, all reason is understood to reflect a particular subjective perspective and may perpetuate systemic distortions, which are hard for you to see if you're in the middle of them and if you benefit from them. There is a recognition that who you are, your identity, shapes the way you see reality from the ground up. So Gutierrez, of course, is affirming one way you have to see reality is from the position of the poor. And that then expands the notion of salvation to a notion of liberation in the expansive sense that Gutierrez defines it, which turns out to be, as he makes clear, the scriptural sense as well. And so he helped to spark a series of theologies of liberations in the 1970s and 1980s, although it must be said each of these theologies of liberation had their own distinct intellectual roots. They're not just informed by Gutierrez. These include black, feminist, womanist, mujerista, queer, and animal theologies of liberation, among others. The relationship between liberation theology and the identity politics of recognition theologies is close, but they are distinct phenomena, with Gutierrez's theology of liberation focused upon issues of class, and the politics of recognition focused upon identity issues indexed to race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, and the like. In the wake of these developments, Gutierrez later in his career acknowledged and largely corrected for his early neglect of the forms of poverty and disempowerment uniquely faced by women. And of course, I think given his openness in his philosophy and theology, he'd be very open also to other forms of identity politics and the other forms of discrete oppression that they unveil. Numerous identity politics theorists and theologians, however, ignore or even reject Gutierrez because he focuses upon class, not the likes of gender, ethnic, or racial identity. This is not only a mistake, given the gross class inequities that permeate our society and world, is a devastatingly harmful mistake. No one can be expert in or address everything, but we should all be concerned with liberation vis-a-vis class and also sex, gender, race, and so forth. So I would, in this sense, be suspicious of anyone who consistently refuses to acknowledge the importance of any of these areas of concern. True intersectional thinking, as this sort of thinking came to be called in the late 80s, among theologians anyway, this sort of thinking was already going by other names in the 70s and early 80s, as we discussed before. But true intersectional thinking should involve keeping track of one's own and others' diverse identities as they are indexed vis-a-vis privilege or oppression, impoverishment, along all of these discrete axes. I am confused by the lack of affirmation of Gutierrez and his emphasis upon class. I would think it would be natural for theorists from all of these perspectives to affirm the importance of work dealing with all the other perspectives. And I'd be very cautious when I encounter anyone who is closed in on only one area of intersection. Now, liberation theology and post-colonial theory. Gutierrez's liberation theology is very similar to what later developed as post-colonial theory, which in many ways is liberation theology without the theology. As a result of this, it's largely limited in influence to intellectual elites, in particular in the academy. Post-colonial theory is influential. Post-colonial theory is focused upon the European colonial legacy and contemporary structures and equalities that can be traced to that legacy, which are obviously massive and enduring. And it urges structural shifts that restore indigenous dignity and flourishing among former colonies and colonizers. Now, obviously, all this aligns closely with Gutierrez's and Pope Francis's theological emphases, but the best-known post-colonial theorists have inherited modern Western intellectual elites' self-serving caricatures and prejudices against religion generally. I discuss this in some of my books, and against Christian theology in particular. Still, there is much intersection of concern and passion for justice, so there should be ample space for constructive dialogue between liberation theology and post-colonial theory, and indeed there have been some interesting attempts to articulate a post-colonial theology. Now, liberation theology and decolonial theory. So in other words, Gutierrez is interested in dynamics of class and economic and political structures which are oppressive, and given his post-colonial context in Peru, obviously that's related to all of these international dynamics, which are the same as post-colonial theory. Now, decolonial theory, and there are, again, many varieties of decolonial and post-colonial theory, but decolonial theory can be seen as a radicalization of post-colonial theory, which at one extreme insists that indigenous expressions of life require indigenous peoples wholly to separate themselves from colonial influences. Some think of decolonial in terms of a correction for an internalized negation of one's own indigenous traditions. And this is an important and liberating concept insofar as indigenous peoples have been taught to disregard or even disrespect their own traditions wholesale. Now, no doubt all traditions have elements that may be criticized, and most all traditions also include, I would think all traditions also include unique and wonderful insights and understandings. But some decolonial rhetoric appear. But nonetheless, this is a good emphasis to try to counter internalized negation. However, some decolonial rhetoric appears to think it has access to what for various peoples would be pure and discrete origins, which is at odds with the hybridity, and then these becomes basis of claims to power and wealth and resources, right? So we are the only ones, and these origins are pure. So they quickly become origin stories that are indexed to imperialistic claims. But it's masked because you're claiming that it's just yours. And this is all at odds with the hybridity built into virtually all, except maybe a handful of the world's cultures and peoples. Aside from its misunderstanding of the history of migration and integration of peoples from prehistoric ages, such appeals to pure origins provide illicit justification for intolerance of hybridity and migration. And this is, of course, is true of faith traditions as it is of peoples, this intolerance. So to give one example of how the idea of decolonization can be oversimplified and hurtful, and this is an anecdote, but I think it's illustrative of a dangerous extreme, harmful extreme. I once listened as a student in one of my classes, herself a non-Indigenous American, in the sense being from the United States, herself a non-Indigenous American Christian. I listened as she confidently explained to a Zambian exchange student, a pastor and leader in his African community, that he should not be Christian because he was African. Or more precisely, he was sub-Saharan African, since North America is home to the Latin Western patristic fathers, including St. Augustine. So North Africa is part of the birthplace of Christianity. Of course, to say that is to forget the degree to which Christianity itself is an outgrowth and integrated out of and still connected to Judaism, which also in its early documents, as we now know, is also a combination of insights from other religious traditions in the ancient Near East. In other words, there's no purity with Christianity, no purity with Judaism, no purity with anything. We have hybridity, migration, the interspersing of ideas, the borrowing of good ideas. It just goes all the way down. So my African student, whose family and tribe had been Christian for generation upon generation, and who worries that the church in the U.S., probably including me, is largely apostate, and whose entire church pastorate and leadership had long since been exclusively African, listened to her politely but remained silent. After class, he assured me he was used to dealing with Americans telling him what Africans should think. But the reality is that one can no longer separate Christianity, or in parts of Africa, Islam, and other European cultural and political forms of identity from Africans' indigenous identity. So Gutierrez, a Spanish-speaking Christian in what is now Peru, which is not indigenously Spanish or Christian, provides a similar example, as do all, except the Zambian student was indigenous to Africa, unlike Gutierrez or us in terms of our regions, although you're beginning to see what indigenous means exactly can get pretty confusing. So in another way, Gutierrez is a Spanish-speaking Christian in what is now Peru, which is not indigenously Spanish or Christian, provides a similar example, as do all non-indigenous peoples who are English, Spanish, German, or Korean-speaking, and so forth, Christians in what is now the United States. So as Gutierrez says, though, in reaction to all of this, there's no turning back the clock. That is simple realism. Now, it is realism, but I don't think it's simple realism, because it is rooted not just in the fact that it is unimaginable to think that all non-indigenous peoples in Peru would leave, and that there would be a wholesale return to peoples and cultures and religions of 15th century pre-contact Peru, but because the idea traffics in the myth of pure origins. Ask, for instance, where would non-indigenous peoples go? Where are they from? and what pre-contact socio-political iteration gets to claim to be indigenous. After all, from what we know about the political realities and what are now the Americas, regimes were transient over the centuries in the Americas as much as in Europe or Asia. So what is indigenous? Whatever was extant at the point of the 15th century contact, or the social-political reality of the 12th or 13th centuries, the days of Anselm and Aquinas, or the 5th century in the Americas, the time of Augustine, or in the 1st, the time of Jesus and Paul. So the point here is not to totally deconstruct the notion of the indigenous. There is a way to use the notion. The point is that once you press it too far, it comes apart at the seams. All right, so this is what I'm suggesting would take very careful reflection and qualification if we were to try to go into it in detail. So consider, as noted above, and I want to make this relevant to us, to my own context. I'm talking about Peru and Gutierrez, but I feel a need also to connect it here. But in the majority of the 17th and 18th centuries, the region where I'm located and making this video, which is now Austin, Texas, was part of the Comanche Empire. As we saw on the map above. But the Comanche themselves had only swept in from the north in the late 16th or early 17th century, displacing other indigenous peoples who, though we're quickly caught within the mists of historical uncertainty as we look back over the centuries, they displaced other people. The people the Comanches displaced themselves, almost certainly of themselves displaced or integrated with other peoples. So, moreover, it is unrealistic to romanticize indigenous peoples who are on the whole no worse and no better than the rest of us. So, how are we to respond to indigenous cultures that were or are riven by inequities and injustice, by sexism, xenophobia, heterosexism, and so forth? Here's where Gutierrez's appeal to the universal, in terms of the Good Samaritan and the feeding of the 5,000, right? Even as he wants the particularity, here's where that universal appeal comes back in. So as we get into these real issues, that's when Gutierrez's thought, its strength becomes more visible, because he's put various things into play, as I'll talk about in a second, which give us ways to think about issues in tension with dynamics which have to be put in balance. Again, the problem is not lack of knowledge or will in terms of some decolonial effort, but the myth of pure origins and unrealistic romanticization, which requires one simply to absolutize one historical era in denial of the fact that humans have never been perfect and have ever been at migrating and mating. For a while, if 1 to 4% of our DNA is to be believed with Neanderthals. We are hybrid and migrating all the way down. And we've been doing this in evolving cultures across Africa early on and eventually across the globe for tens of thousands of years. So as one gains a sense for all the complexities in play, let alone an awareness of how powerful and deeply embedded are decades and even centuries-old global structures of oppression, it is easy to become discouraged, even fatalistic. Who can know precisely what an ideal world should look like? Who of us could make that claim with confidence? Where is the humility? That's where the humility. How are we to balance all the various injustices and achievements? How are we to balance these? How do we overcome resistance from those, though this is not everyone, certainly, who are affluent, but the resistance of those who are numb to suffering and injustice by their affluence, and so committed to the inequities of the status quo. On the other hand, the issues are so complex. It is not the case that a sudden redistribution of money or power or the like will solve the problems. The forms of impoverishment are multiple, and the issues are impossibly complex. Realism in this instance is to feel overwhelmed, and it is precisely in this context that I think the strength of Gutierrez's approach is manifest. As we've seen, for Gutierrez, theology offers a multifaceted understanding of the various forms of poverty: economic, physical, cultural, social, spiritual, political, and so forth, and he unfolds correlate forms of liberation. He includes salvation in the spiritual sense, but then expands our sense for salvation along the lines of Wesley, Jesus, and the prophets, among others, to include salvation and liberation from all forms of injustice and poverty. He attends to both structural dynamics and personal control concerns, and he combines realism, frank analysis of present realities, and realistic near-term possibilities. Humility, he combines realism, humility, looking for constant reformation towards utopia, not sudden revolution to a present idea of utopia. And idealism, he doesn't drop the utopian vision, even as it's going to be provisional, even as one is realistic about near-term possibilities. One never loses a vision for the ideals one hopes are realized in the long sweep of history. In addition, he invites diverse rationalities and figures, priest, prophet, sovereign, to play their proper roles. This means that he acknowledges that we need experts in diverse spheres, law, politics, economics, ethics, and spirituality, as we strive to move forward. On this reading of Gutierrez's theology, he is acknowledging that we are not wise enough to have all the answers or even an adequate vision of what a perfect society might look like, let alone the ability to create such a society in the short term. This should preclude revolutionary action, in particular revolutionary violence. It should preclude it, but it should not preclude utopian dreams or continual work to make tomorrow better than today as we strive slowly but steadily and insistently to shape history on what we hope will be its long arc towards justice. It should go without saying to those familiar with the Pentateuch, Kings, and Chronicles, wisdom literature, the prophets, the Gospels, and their portrayal of the life and work of Jesus Christ, the exhortations of Paul, the book of James, the theologies of Luther, Calvin, Wesley, Barth, Bonhoeffer, King, Cone, Luther, and so many others. It should go without saying to those familiar with all of these that Jewish and Christian faith is not only about spiritual salvation from sin, it is also about love of neighbor and passion for what is merciful, loving, and just. While his use of the tools of the modern social sciences sets Gutierrez apart from pre-20th century theologians, all of his emphases are consistent with the classic emphases of Scripture, the saints, and the mainstream of theology, which is one reason why Gutierrez's works are simply filled with references and exegesis of Scripture. His use of the term liberation began as a counter to 1960s political use of the term development, in the sense of developed versus developing nations and all the problems involved in that. But he then made it into the prominent identifier of his theology, where it is used to restore ideas of sin and salvation, ideas which have been truncated into individualistic, spiritual, faith not works sense, to restore ideas of sin and salvation to their traditional and full scope. As a result, and by traditional I mean scriptural and early the church and the Gospels, as a result, liberation theology is especially resistant to the sort of reductionistic interpretation that has so often distorted our understanding of salvation by confining it within spiritualized faith not works parameters. That may be one reason why resistance to the term is so severe. In other words, it's hard to reduce the term to a merely spiritual sense. Not surprisingly, many, not all, but many in positions of prestige and influence in the developed world, together with elites in the so-called developing world, have been vigilant and quick with ad hominem attacks and extremist caricatures of Gutierrez's theology. This may be the sort of context within which one should understand, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Gutierrez is simply insisting that to be a follower of Jesus Christ is to live in accord with the entirety of the witness of Jesus' life and ministry, including his concrete calls to love of neighbor. To be part of the church is to be part of a community which reflects upon and celebrates and acts and witnesses in accord with the Christian hope and salvation, liberation from oppression in all its forms. There is truth to the ditty. This is my final closing remark. There is truth to the ditty. On Sunday, the golden rule. On Monday, the one with the gold rules. And many people in our churches who come from all walks of life will work and strive to survive in a world where gold rules. Their careers or even their legally sworn fiduciary responsibilities may require it. In such a convoluted context, there are no easy answers and no quick escape. But Gutierrez is urging us that to be a true part of the Christian church means remembering the full witness of Jesus Christ and the prophets. It means living in the tensions honestly, and it means to be working always, as much as one is able, to try to shape the flow of history so that we are moving steadily, if slowly, to bend the arc of history towards justice.